Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News. My name is Tom and today we are doing another book review. This is the fourth and final book review based on the last set of books that were sent to us by the fine folks at Casemate Publishing, so of course we thank them for these copies, and I saved the best for last because this is the book I was most looking forward to when they sent me the list of what they had available, and I was not disappointed. The book we're looking at today is The Tanks of Operation Barbarossa, Soviet versus German Armor on the Eastern Front by Boris Kavalerchik. I'm guessing on the pronunciation there. Translated by Stuart Britton, because he is a Russian author, or according to the info they sent me, he was a mechanical engineer from the USSR who served as an officer in the Soviet Armed Forces Reserve before immigrating to the United States. So that's the author's background. He's written a couple other books, and you can probably find those on Amazon. I think they list them. The details on this book, price-wise, $42.95 in the U.S., £25 in the U.K. It is from Pen and Sword, is the individual publisher. 288 pages, 20 illustrations, and those are sort of in separate little sections. They're not interspersed throughout the text. Hardback, of course, and it's 6 by 9 inches on the binding. This book came out in June 14 of this year, so it's still a pretty recent new book. I will say that this is probably one of my favorite reads of the year so far. There are a lot of books I get and I review, and they're good books, but they're, you know, I've read quite a bit on the topic, obviously, and it's not often I find something where I'm learning a lot of new things, and I did from this. I think there's just a lot of information here on Soviet tank development leading up to World War II that maybe hasn't really, you know, it might be familiar to people who read Russian, but I don't know if it's made it into U.S., or I should say English language books yet. So I was very impressed. I ripped through this thing in like 2 nights. It's a good read. As far as the book itself, it's a hardcover. You just hear sort of regular kind of textbook with a couple of color sections. That's why I'm doing this one with my face instead of some of the other reviews where I've had the camera point down at the book itself. Like, there's not much to see with the book. It's, you know, words on paper. I think we're all familiar with that, obviously. So, just going through it a little bit chapter by chapter. It's the way it's laid out. It's interesting. He starts off kind of explaining some like sort of basic factors about tank design and what's important, you know, what people tend to overlook, sort of giving like sort of a basis for people that may be a little newer to the subject, which is sort of nice, but will still be interesting to people who have read quite a bit. So chapter 1, main factors that determine the design of tanks, you know, and there's a few pages on that. It's fairly short. Then chapter 2 is the role of tanks. Then he starts again the actual specifics. So chapter 3 is Germany's panzer forces. Chapter 4 is the Wehrmacht's panzers. So he's looking at the individual vehicles. Chapter 5 is German panzers in combat. Then in chapter 6 is really the heart of the book, which is Soviet armored forces. Chapter 7, history of tanks in the Red Army. 8 is the pre-war Soviet tanks. And those are, I mean, obviously it says it's Tanks of Operation Barbarossa, but the focus really is on the Soviet stuff, because that's what he's researching. And, you know, it makes sense because the German stuff's been pretty well covered in a lot of ways. So, and he's Russian, he speaks Russian, he has access to the Russian archives. So that makes sense. Then he sort of, chapter 9, qualitative characteristics of the tanks. Chapter 10, the survivability of tanks and crews. So he's kind of looking at, in those 2 chapters, things about these vehicles that you might not know, particularly looking at a lot of the reports that were made by government agencies testing these vehicles, evaluating them, and looking at how they actually worked in combat. Chapter 11 is a little different because that one he's actually recounting a specific tank battle, which is at another name I'm going to slaughter, Ryazanau, Lithuania, 1941. And then chapter 12, the final chapter, is results of the initial fighting. That's kind of a summary, sort of explaining, you know, why, despite the huge numerical advantage that the Russians had in tanks in 1941, their armored forces did so poorly in the first few months of Operation Barbarossa. Then he's got several interesting appendices, which are reprints of some tactical or some tests that were done, as well as quite a few information charts, comparative charts of different vehicles, comparing things, you know, guns, suspension systems, mobility, all that kind of stuff. And that's pretty much it. Unfortunately, there's no bibliography given, but I mean, he does have an endnotes section, which is quite comprehensive, and it's interesting. You'll see quite a bit in it over and over again. Is TSAMO and RGVA, and I was like, I think those are archives, maybe. So I shot a message over to Peter over at Tank Archives, who lives and breathes stuff, and I said, what do these stand for? And he's like, oh, the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense and Russian State Military Archives. So, the notes section is just packed full of references to the archives. In his examination of Soviet tanks, I would say he's very critical. So if you're looking for somebody who's going to be talking about how great Soviet tank design is, this isn't the book. He's very critical. Not to the point of like, when compared to Milechek's T-34 Mythical Weapon, if you're familiar with that book, that one he's just like starts off just like putting his bias right out there to see. I think this one he's justified. He backs everything up that he says, and obviously the record of these vehicles in 1941 sort of speaks for themselves. That said, he definitely focuses more on the Soviet side of things and their failings, less so on German stuff. Now, as far as the things that I found really interesting, because I didn't know as much, he gets, like particularly with the T-34, really gets into the development of that, talking about the individual figures that were involved in that development. And when you hear those stories, it really makes you realize that, good Lord, I'm glad I wasn't designing Soviet tanks in the 1930s, because back then, when you got fired, it was more you were in front of a firing squad. It wasn't, some of these guys ended up, they didn't end up retiring on a pension and having a nice life. It's a little scary because we're talking about late 30s Stalinist Russia. We've read about the military purges that are going on. Well, it's also, some of these designers. In fact, one of the designers was basically in prison and having to sort of design stuff during the day, and then in the evening having to go back to his room and being locked in there because he's technically a prisoner. So it's hard to get your head around that kind of thing, coming from the Western world and having family who worked in the defense industry here. It's like, I guess we had a little better off. So that's some interesting stuff and some interesting details that, is not readily available in some other English language sources. The other things of note, just some nice little things, nice little summary. One of those things that's like, I always sort of saw snippets, but I never really had a good explanation. Why were German tanks, they always put the transmission in the front? And he just lays it out here, 1, 2, 3 points, boom, 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 boom. All of these I had read before, sort of, but never had it laid out like that comprehensively. And it's just sort of nice to see that. I mean, he approaches this in a lot of ways as an engineer, looking at these systems and giving really concrete technical explanations for certain things. But like I said, without losing the larger historic narrative. The only other thing I'll say as far as the tone of the book, like I said, it is a very critical tone on some of these Russian tanks, particularly the early war ones, particularly the T-34, which he points out lots of issues, and in particular, the size of the turret ring and how cramped it was. There's an interesting little detail in there how, the one machine they had for cutting turret rings was lost in the initial German invasion. So until they could get a new one from the United States, they couldn't really enlarge the turret ring on the T-34. Interesting little detail. So it points out the importance of, sometimes there's just these weird little technical bottlenecks that you don't really know about until somebody actually goes in the archives and reads these little details. And that's what makes it interesting. Again, like I said, he does quote a lot from, testing reports from different agencies, and I will say this, in that when you really focus so much on those kind of reports, you can make any vehicle look really bad. Because, of course, those reports are written critically. Like, they're trying to find things that are flaws. And it's sort of always hard when years later, those of us that, I've never had an opportunity to actually be in a T-34. I haven't driven one around. So it's, when you read those kind of analyses and reports, it's a little hard to figure out what is actually really critical stuff and what's maybe more nitpicking, or maybe isn't that bad compared to other vehicles of the day. So that was the only thing that sort of went off in my head, when he's being very critical about these vehicles, and like I said, in the appendices is one of those reports. I've read enough of those from different countries to kind of take them always with a little bit of a grain of salt. because, you know, that's their job, is to be really critical. And if you really want, you could probably take any vehicle, and if you gathered up all those reports and posted them all together, you can make a really compelling argument that this particular tank sucks. But aside from that, you know, I don't want to make it, I'm not trying to make it sound like there's a really strong bias here. I think it, like I said, this is one of my favorite books of the year. I highly recommend it. If you're interested in Soviet armor of the early World War II stage, go buy it, or, you know, get the ebook reader version, whatever. It's well worth adding to your library, and I hope that this author continues to write, because I did enjoy this book. I liked the style it was written in. I will say this, I don't know, you know, I've read some other books that were translated by Stuart Britton, and this one I thought read better, and I don't know if that's because the source materials read better or he's getting better, but if you hadn't told me this book was translated, I probably wouldn't have noticed. So I think that's good, and yeah, I guess that's it. So we will catch you on the next one.